Letters from Yorkshire by Maura Dooley. Let's look first of all at the title. Letters are quite an archaic form. Perhaps they remind us of a bygone era. But certainly when you receive a letter, especially one that's been handwritten, there is that real sense that in some ways it's more real than modern communication, because you can actually touch the piece of paper that the other person has touched, and perhaps it's more intimate in some way. The fact that letters have come from Yorkshire suggests a rural environment, perhaps even agrarian, like agricultural kind of environment. And certainly when we read on in the poem, we do discover that she's writing to someone who works on a farm, who lives on a farm, it seems. The fact there's more than one letter, though, in this poem suggests that these letters have been treasured. There's lots of them, and this person's looking back over them, and they've kept them. Which again is something quite unique to poems, that you sort of wrap them to letters, that you wrap them up on paper and you put them away somewhere to come back to them later. But they're certainly, because they've only come from Yorkshire, these letters, we want to know who are they from. And as I continue to read this poem, having read that title, I'm going to be thinking, who is it that she's writing to? And I'm not sure I'm ever going to find out the answer actually in this poem. Now we move on to the beginning of the poem. It says, in February. This is obviously a winter month, but it's the end of the winter. It's nearly spring, and the idea of spring certainly is continued, because the birds are coming home, we're planting new life. So there's a really positive element to this poem, that new life is coming and winter is coming to an end. And in some ways, as the poem progresses, the letters are what bring that warmth. He's digging in his garden. He's planting potatoes. These different active verbs and that kind of plosive alliteration on the planting potatoes. It shows that it's a really mundane action, but in a way, through this alliteration, it's given a sense of musicality. So, romance. A lot of this poem is about whether there is romance in the rural life or not, and actually she asks that question a little bit later on. Now, as the birds are returning, lapwings are a type of birds. After they've migrated, they're coming back. And the question here, and this causes the other person that she's writing to come into the house and write a letter to her. Inspires him, whoever he is. Now, maybe that suggests that she is someone who is away and he's thinking about her coming home. Who knows? Maybe he misses her, or maybe he's just thinking about someone who's far away. Let's just make a note here that we still don't know who he is in the poem. We do know, because we know a little bit about Maura Dooley's life, that she has lived in Yorkshire. What we don't know is whether that this is her father maybe, or a sibling, or a friend. Certainly, we get to the end of the poem, we'll certainly realise that it's someone that she's close to in some ways, maybe even just as a pen pal. Now, when he comes in from the really cold outside, his knuckles are singing. This personification of the knuckles is also interesting, because it again adds this musicality to what he's doing, which we keep seeing. The basic mundane life on the farm is given something artistic, something more. It's been elevated. And also the idea of singing, what our skin might feel like it's doing when it's cold and we're coming out of the cold and it's warming up and it stings a little bit. That's quite that terminology is sort of like local dialect, and suggests again a connection through language between them. Now here we've got, as they reddened in the warmth. So the knuckles are reddening in the warmth. This is really nice bit of multi-sensory description. So we've got the sound from the singing, we've got the use of the colour red, which can suggest life and blood, can also suggest anger, but there's little here to suggest that that connotation is really relevant. And the sense of the warmth, the feeling, really vivid, the real sense of vitality in writing the letter to her, that it's bringing life to him as he comes in from the cold. And as we move through this stanza, we then have this kind of change in pronoun, which really makes us ask questions. So we've moved from he, here, down to you. And there is a bit of a sense here that she's addressing him directly now. So as he starts to write the letter, maybe she's receiving the letter. Maybe that has sort of rekindled their sense of intimacy. And then we've got this really strange line, I think, here, where it says it's not romance, simply how things are. Sort of odd and jarring, because we're thinking to ourselves, well, what isn't romance? Does she mean what he's doing and all this kind of multi-sensory, knuckles singing, reddening, the warmth? Is he really excited by the idea? Perhaps we got that here. Perhaps he's excited to be writing to her, but not because there's romance between them. What isn't romance? Is it their relationship that isn't a romantic one? Is it his rural life that isn't romantic? Is it the whole business of planting and bringing new life into the world, albeit potatoes? Is it that isn't romantic? So there's a real question there, because it's quite a blunt statement, but it seems to be an observation of their relationship in some way. She says, when she changes this pronoun, you out there in the cold, seeing the seasons turning, So a little bit of enjambment after seasons there, and he's actually seeing them. She says, me with my heart full of headlines. So this next stanza is going to focus on her and her experiences. And it, again, quite interesting because this enjambment, but also, I think, the alliteration, seeing the seasons, heart full of headlines. In some ways kind of creates links between them, even though they're a long way away. And so these two pronouns emphasize their differences. But that they're brought together somehow through the language, through the enjambment, through the alliteration. Because, of course, she could have had turning at the end of this line, seeing the seasons turning, and then this whole stanza was about her, but she connects them together, as she does all the way through the poem. When we talk about form in a minute, we'll see this more. She connects them together with the use of this enjambment. And then she talks about her heart full of headlines. Quite an interesting image there, because normally you would think about a handful of headlines. As we read on through the stanza, because we're obviously wondering what heart full of headlines is all about, she talks about feeding words onto a blank screen, and we can connect this then with the work we've done on context and think about how she is a writer. And that she feels emotional, passionate about what she's writing, heart full of headlines. But unfortunately, as she feeds the words onto a blank screen, it's almost like the blank screen, she can't see who she's writing the words for. She's typing them into a blank screen. It's kind of eating up her words and her passion. It's eating up her words and her passion. And this clearly suggests that she's not really fulfilled by her experiences as she does this, as she's doing this writing. So her passion and her sense of self that she puts into the poem through her heart. So her job in a way isn't really fulfilling. And she then leads on to ask this question: is your life more real because you dig and sow? And this is the only line in the poem where this is the only stanza in the poem that's been end stopped. But even then, it's been end stopped with this rhetorical question. So this would suggest, wouldn't it, a turning point in the poem. And there is a bit of a turning point here. She's talked about their different experiences when they're living in different places. Now she's kind of really asking questions about the significance of their different lives. And she starts to think about whether actually being at one with the land is in some way more real, more sort of earthy than the life that she leads. She says, you wouldn't say so. Breaking ice on a water butt, clearing a path through snow. So he doesn't romanticize or glamorize his life in any way. Breaking ice on the water butt, clearing a path through snow. In fact, it sounds like hard work. A bit thankless, a little bit like her work. But she says, Still, it's you who sends me word of that other world. And what I really like here is that enjambment here of still, it's you, which creates that pause after you. And it's really affectionate, reflective pause. Which sort of elevates his importance, who sends me word of that other world. And that other world sounds almost like it's beyond normality. Who sends me word of that other world. And this line is so interesting in so many ways, because look here, these two words, not only do they alliterate, there's only one letter that's different between them. So half rhyme, they almost rhyme, word and world. And what's really interesting about that is the idea that the word, that language can connect her to another world, as in Yorkshire, but also another world that is perhaps even spiritual in some way. When we talk about otherworldly, we mean supernatural in some way. So it's language that creates this kind of special connection between them, which we're going to look at a little bit more in the last stanza. And here it talks about pouring air and light into an envelope. So when he sends these letters, first of all, they've got quite a unique ability, letters in this poem, kind of unique quality of letters, where you can physically pour something into the envelope that you're going to send somewhere else. And what he is pouring into the envelope is this beautiful metaphorical idea of air and light. So it's like he is sending life to her, because obviously we need air and light to live. And it almost suggests that her life is dark, it's suffocating. And she needs his letters to live. She needs to be reminded of a rural life in order to continue with her life and be healthy. They give her something that she just doesn't get living in a city, being a writer, which we know that she does. We know she's a famous writer, Maura Dooley, because of our work on context. We also know that she was brought up in Cornwall, which again is a rural environment, depending on the land for its income mostly, as well as tourism. So he sends her these letters so that at night, watching the same news in different houses, here, first of all, we've got this antithesis of same and difference, which and different, suggesting that there's distance between them, they're apart, they're living different lives, they're experiencing the world in different ways, and yet they are also experiencing the same things, the same news. So in a way, through another medium this time, TV, they experience the same kind of narrative of what's going on around them. So the same story. So if you like, what news does is it kind of creates a story about the world that we have in common. That might be a bit different from what we actually experience day to day, but it's a story and narrative that makes sense about the world around us. And at the end of the poem, there's a real sense that the distance between them is cold. This is almost pathetic fallacy, almost like the ice wants to keep them apart. But interestingly, their souls are tapping out messages to keep them together. So these messages and the choice of that noun souls really shows that they have a really deep connection despite this distance between them that will always be there. Okay, so the communication is really, really important in this poem. Let's just have a look for a moment at the form of the poem and make a few notes on that before we finish. Now that we've looked at the whole thing, we realise that there isn't really a regular rhyme or rhythm scheme. So this is free verse. And a bit like the Simon Armitage poem, Mother Any Distance, in a sense what this does, even though Mother Any Distance is written actually within a very strict form, but this really does create the sense that this is ordinary language that has been elevated to the kind of symbolic, reflective, universal, poignant level because it's written in poetic form. And in this poem, it's more the use of pause and opportunities to reflect. Form is used really carefully to create connections. It's written in these little tercets, these groups of 3 lines, almost like they represent the short letters. So the brief communication between them, the short letters that they write. In brackets letters there, I think, make that really clear in your notes. But throughout the poem, with the one exception of the end of the 3rd stanza, enjambment is used, which suggests this kind of sense of communication between them. This communication is reciprocal, backwards and forwards, and they're always linked to each other through language. It's kind of a flowing form of communication. In terms of theme, well, we've certainly got the idea in this poem that the writer is questioning whether the natural world that this person she's writing to is superior to the world that she is living in. And there's great respect for the natural world, even though she's now living as a poet in a city. And she is also, later on in her life, a lecturer in literature at a big university. So she still really respects kind of her roots and also the sense of humanity's roots, really, looking back into our history and how we always used to live. There's certainly a theme here of communication and the importance of a communication between human beings, in this instance through letters, but perhaps you could extend that to poetry and the idea of souls tapping out messages and the way that we communicate with each other as human beings being really important. And of course, relationships, that we kind of need relationships, and how much it gives her to continue some kind of a relationship, not in this case romantic, probably not even a parent-child relationship, because I think that pointing her out of it's not romance, simply how things are, isn't the sort of thing you would write about your father, I think, unless you were only talking about the romance of the rural world, and I don't think she is. I think she's sort of probably making a statement here about how their relationship isn't one of romance, but it is important to keep connections between human beings in our lives. Even though we might be living in very different worlds, very different jobs, that as human beings we can always connect to each other. And I think underneath all of this poem there's that real kind of warmth between human beings, even though their experiences are very different. That really is a universal idea.